Hello, Bible readers. Lots to get to today because I'm in Genesis 11:30 to 12:9. This is the pivotal text in Genesis. If you don't take notes on these posts, this might be one to write some things down. Arguably, in the whole Old Testament, this is the pivotal text, and you might even say it's the pivotal text in the whole Bible. It links the traditions of God's care for the world, which is the first 11 chapters of Genesis, with God's electing call of Israel, beginning with this one person, Abraham and Sarah. The history of Israel begins with the promise of God and the responding faith of Abraham. And I've talked about that the last few days. We go from the history of the curse to the history of God's blessing. There's a lot to say about this text. I'm going to start with thoughts about God's speech meeting barrenness and what happens when those two things combine. The family of Abraham has roots, as we see in the genealogies just before today's text, that now in Abraham and Sarah's generation has withered up. Those roots have borne no fruit in this generation. Brueggemann says, barrenness is the way of human history. It's where all human history ends up. It's an effective metaphor for hopelessness. There is no foreseeable future. There is no human power to invent a future. And then he goes on to say, the marvel of biblical faith is that barrenness is the arena of God's life-giving action. Think creation as God's voice broods over the nothingness, or Jesus' resurrection. From the dead he rises. Barrenness is God's playground, showing again and again that something can be brought out of nothing. In Genesis 12:1, we read, and the Lord said to Abram. God's speech has its way over barrenness. That's what happens when the two things meet. God's speech wins. The effect of this speech is to call the barren ones, Abram and Sarai, on a pilgrimage. And they go obediently. Brueggemann says, in its fear, the world settles for silence, ideology, propaganda. In its doubt, the world listens for less powerful words. But says our God, God's word breaks all these resistances. And that's how unbridled faith like Abraham's is possible. He receives what God speaks. What does God speak? Well, the promise. That's what makes this such a pivotal part of the Bible. There are 5 first-person statements from God. I will make of you. Despite them being barren, he says, I will make of you. I will bless you. I will magnify your name. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. The future, not to be received by Israel, it's not to be achieved or accomplished by Israel. That feels like freeloading to many people, that the future will be done by God and then given rather than earned by Israel. It's part of what makes grace scandalous to our world. Can you imagine living in a world ordered by gifts rather than being full of landmines, knowing we have to make our own way? Think of the difference of mindset one would have to wake up and wonder, what gifts does God have in store for me today? Versus, how am I going to survive today? How can I dominate others today? How can I achieve victory for myself today? God promises to gift us with well-being, with security, with prosperity, with prominence. Abraham and Sarah won't ever be able to create any of those things on their own in the midst of the barrenness that is their lives. It can only be given to them. But the giving depends on receiving. Upon Israel's admitting that life is held by God, to accept the promise, they have to accept the promise maker. And so in chapter 12, verses 4 to 9, the metaphor of journey takes over as a way of describing the response, which we would call faith. Brueggemann says the life of faith is one which keeps Israel in pursuit of the land of promise. The pursuit. The world would have us want and yearn for settlement and security and placement. But a life of faith is unsettled. It's seeking. It's on the move. It's in pursuit. Christian discipleship is even described in the New Testament as the way. The early church called about it being the way. That was really no new language in the early church when we think of Abram's journey. He was called to go, not to settle. Following the way, journeying, is difficult. That's another thing to notice about this story and what we'll learn about following the way. Almost by definition, following a way is difficult. Abraham's initial entry into the land is faced with the reality of Canaanites, who are not depicted as a physical impediment as much as a spiritual impediment, because their ways look more attractive, they look easier, they look more pleasurable than this way of following God. This will be the challenge of Israel from this point on. Do we live in the promises of God like no one else, or live like the Canaanites, or whoever, like everyone else? Do we live differently from everyone or not? Notice it's not Abram's work to convert other peoples or bear witness to God. He's called simply to go, receive the promises, live differently. Last thing, in verse 8, when Abram calls on the name of the Lord, this is a bigger deal than we probably think. It means to turn to one named as the single authority. It's a life-identifying decision to call on this name, and it's a direct connection to the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods. When you put this calling on God's name together with God's promise to bless all the nations, we get, and this is the last big thing I'm going to tell you about this text. Number one, all people are included into the promises of this God. And two, all people's loyalties belong to this one God. So it's radical inclusiveness on God's part, calling for radical exclusivity when it comes to worshiping God. There is just one God. Brueggemann calls it horizontal inclusiveness, vertical exclusiveness. All right, next I'm going to get into chapter 12, verse 10 through chapter 13, verse 18. I hope you join me. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.